So the first day of school is next week, or it's quickly coming up, and you've set up your classroom, written your students' names on name tags, and maybe you even color coded your supply bins. But you're starting to wonder, how do I get students to follow expectations during the first week of school? Sure, you've done student teaching, but maybe you haven't actually seen anybody introduce expectations in class before, and you're wondering, how do you go about doing it? Because the truth is, when the first days of school hits, for many teachers, the classroom can feel chaotic, and you can't figure out why your students aren't listening to you and aren't following expectations. Well, here's the truth problem for you. Most new teachers make the same classroom management mistake during back to school season. So let's break it down so you can avoid making this mistake completely and start your school year off with calm and confidence. So, with that being said, let's dive in. Now, the number one classroom management mistake new teachers make is they're not teaching procedures like a lesson. You see, most new teachers assume that they can just tell their students how to behave once and they'll remember. They'll just tell their students to line up and they'll know exactly what it means to line up. But in reality, students need procedures to be taught, modeled, practiced, and reinforced consistently, just like a lesson. Because the truth is, many of us teachers have different ways of going about things. If you go into one classroom and see how one teacher has her students line up, it's going to be completely different than the teacher down the hallway who has them line up a different way. Sure, the same general concept is the same, but the expectations are different. So think of procedures the same way you teach a reading strategy or a math concept, with intention and repetition. You wouldn't just tell your kids to go read a book without showing them the letters first. First, you would model and you would teach, model, practice, and reinforce consistently until they built the stamina to be able to read that book on their own. It's the same thing with procedures. And this was a huge mistake I made when I first started teaching. I would tell my students to line up or to get their math books out, and I would be frustrated because they wouldn't do it the way I wanted them to. And I felt like they were intentionally not following expectations. But then it hit me, why am I not teaching classroom procedures the way I'm teaching everything else? Good teachers know, kind of like the release model, that you need to explicitly teach, model, and practice, and then reinforce for a student to truly get a concept. The same goes with our classroom management. So, really being intentional about that. And this is like I said, a mistake a lot of teachers make. And in fact, I did too. So, now that we talked about the number one classroom management mistake teachers make, let's talk about why this mistake happens and why it matters. So you're overwhelmed with content planning, meet the teacher night, and classroom setup. And when your students come in, you just assume students should know better. I mean, they've had teachers before, right? So they should know how to line up. Or you give directions on the fly, and they should be able to listen to those directions and do it. Well, like I said before, we have different ways of doing things, and if we're not explicitly teaching the expectations, kids are going to do whatever they think is best, and sometimes that means talking to their friends. If I tell my students to get in line for recess, and I haven't explicitly taught that procedure, I'm just going based off the assumption that the previous teacher has taught them this, then they might think, okay, I'm going to get in line for recess. They might be talking, they might be running, they might be having their hands all over each other, touching each other, messing around. And I'm leaving that up to the interpretation of the student instead of being explicit on what I'm expecting at that time. So when procedures aren't clearly taught, that's when the chaos really creeps in. What it feels like when you haven't taught expectations explicitly, and some symptoms or some things you might notice in your classroom as a good indicator that it might be time to review or to explicitly teach those procedures is maybe you have to give constant reminders. Don't run when we get in line. Don't run when we go wash your hands for lunch. You're repeating yourself all day. It feels like you're a record or a record player playing over and over again. Your students are constantly testing boundaries, and then it feels like you're losing control. Like you feel like you're constantly putting out fires, and that your students just don't listen to you and they just don't care. So, those are all indicators of what this can kind of show up as, and it can be hard to teach when you're in that environment. That's why it's so important to be explicit when you teach those classroom procedures and to teach them as you would a lesson. So now that we talked about the number one mistake most teachers make when it comes to back to school and classroom management, and we talked about why this mistake happens and why it matters, let's talk about how to avoid the mistake step by step. So the first thing you're going to do is decide on key procedures ahead of time. Now, let's go over the definition of a procedure really fast. My definition of a classroom procedure is how you expect students to interact or react or act with each other or throughout the classroom, with items throughout the classroom. So some examples of this could be how they enter in the classroom, how they turn in work, how they line up, how they ask or go to use the restroom, how they transition between subjects, how they grab their pencil, their math book. All of these are great examples of different classroom procedures. And if you actually want a huge list of all the classroom procedures I teach in my classroom, make sure to check out my classroom procedure slides. If you check out the description of these slides, you will see that I have over 40 classroom procedures I explicitly teach in my classroom. And what's great about this resource is they are done for you, meaning I put how I personally teach these classroom procedures in there. You don't have to teach it the same way, but if you're wanting some ideas on what it could look like, definitely check that out. So after we talked about some examples, let's think about what routines will help your classrooms run without you micromanaging or having to say a word. The great thing about classroom procedures is that when you've been explicit and when you've taught them and practiced them enough, your students will automatically do them. They will become a habit. It'll be natural, like brushing your teeth. So decide on key procedures ahead of time. So in general, I like to pick anywhere from 3 to 5 to focus on per week. So I will pick my main 3 to 5 classroom procedures I'm going to focus on during the first week of school, and I will make sure to really teach these and really in-depth get them down to the point where my students will do it like a habit and not have to think about it. And then I'll move on to the next 3 to 5. Kind of be flexible with this. If your students seem to really grasp the classroom procedures without you having to remind them, then you can move on. Or if they need to keep reviewing those ones, then I would stay. It really just depends on what kind of class and grade level and age group you're working with. So that's the first step. Decide on key procedures ahead of time. Second thing, teach procedures like a lesson. So this is how I personally teach classroom procedures. You can do them totally different. But the first thing I do is I like to introduce the classroom procedure. Today we're going to be learning about what it should look like and sound like to line up. And the second step is to model exactly what it looks like and sounds like. I will physically get up and model and say, pretend I'm a student, and I will get up and show them what it should look like and sound like. After I do that, we'll have a discussion. What did it look like and sound like? It looked like you had walking feet. It sounded like a level 0. Good. Then I'm going to model the wrong way to do it. I'm going to get up and show them what it should not look like and sound like, and then we're going to have a discussion on what this procedure should not look like and sound like. After we've had a discussion, I'm going to ask a few students to model and demonstrate what this classroom procedure should look like and sound like, and then have the whole class practice, and we're going to repeat it daily for the first week or that week that we're focusing it on, over and over and over again until it's perfect. That way they build that repetition of that skill until it becomes a habit. So that's how I personally like to teach procedures and how I teach them like a lesson. It's very similar to the release model that I mentioned earlier, but again, if you want to see more in depth of what my resources and how I teach classroom procedures, definitely check out the classroom procedure slides because it'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. And like I said, I already did it for you. Now, the third thing, or the third step to avoid this mistake is to use visuals and consistency. Develop display expectations with visual slides or posters. I like to use these slides and I like to bring them up and put them on the board. And whenever I notice that my students need a quick review or we need to redo or reteach a procedure, I will pull these up and it already has a visual representation on there for them. And then what you're going to do is make sure you're being consistent. You can say, ooh, I love, make sure to compliment what you do like and mention what part of the expectation do you not like. Oh, for example, I love how student X is using walking feet. However, I don't love how I had 3 students who used running feet or had a voice level 4. Can the whole class go back and try again? And then we're gonna practice until we can all do it again. So make sure to use those visuals and be consistent. Have your students re-practice and redo as needed so it becomes a habit. Again, procedures is just creating habits in the classroom. And the final step is to reinforce with praise and reteaching. We kind of touched on this earlier, but make sure to catch students doing right and name it out loud in the specific part of the expectation they're following. I love how student A is getting their pencil out at a level 1 or a level 0. I love how student X is turning in their work with walking feet, hands to self. And then if they slip up, if they make a mistake, pause, reteach, and have them try again. I personally don't like calling them out by name. I like saying, I noticed that several students weren't following the expectation by doing X, Y, Z. Let's practice as a class until we can do the procedure while doing X, Y, Z. So making sure not to name drop by any means, but making sure to be explicit on what part of the expectation procedure they're following and which part you noticed as a class they are not, and have them practice until everybody can do it at that level. So that wraps up the number 1 mistake most teachers make when it comes to back to school and classroom management. So as a recap, the biggest mistake most teachers make when it comes to back to school and classroom management is they're not teaching classroom procedures like a lesson. The second thing we talked about is why this mistake happens and why it matters for the rest of your school year. The third thing we talked about was how to avoid making this mistake step by step. I walked you through my formula for teaching classroom procedures like a lesson, and I even gave you some examples and some resources you can refer back to if you need help with teaching classroom procedures or some ideas in the future. So that wraps up everything about the classroom management mistake for many first-year teachers and new teachers make. If you want to dive deeper into back to school and classroom management, I have several resources for you. The first thing I highly recommend you check out my free content. In weeks past, I've definitely covered classroom setup and back to school season, as well as classroom management. I have a ton of resources wherever you're tuning in from, so make sure to go check that out. Second thing, if you want help with more back to school tips, I highly recommend you check out the Classroom Setup Guide. This is my free guide where I took the top 10 questions I've been asked by other teachers around the world in regards to getting ready for back to school. I answered them in a guide, a free guide, and then I went out and I made blog posts, podcasts, and YouTube videos on those questions for a more in-depth answer, and I linked to them in that guide. So instead of searching through my over 150 weeks of content, you can just go to that guide, look at the question, find your question, and find the resource if you want a more in-depth answer than I provide in the guide to save you time and from sifting through all my week's content. The third resource I have for you, if you're wanting access to my templates, my done-for-you edible templates that I use every back-to-school season, and I have sent many of the teachers that I'm either friends with or that I've coached one-on-one or in my programs to get ready for back to school season, I highly recommend you check out the Classroom Setup Bundle. This bundle has everything including 5 different themed classroom procedure slides. Things like farm style, nature, beach, ocean, and polka dot are the 5 I currently have. So you can look at those. Even if you want ideas and examples, definitely check those out. But I also have Meet the Teacher Night slides, back to school forms, weekly newsletters, everything like that. I have a ton. I think it's over 26 templates at this point, so definitely go check that out if you just want all the templates done for you so you can use them and replicate them this back to school season. The final resource I have for you is if you want me to walk you through this strategy to not only having strong classroom management before the school year starts, but also how to set up your classroom with intention to prevent disruptive behavior from occurring by setting up with flow in mind, to how to plan out the first couple weeks of school, to how to have strong relationships with family, including preparing for back to school and meet the teacher night, and also classroom management, I highly recommend you check out my Classroom Kickstart mini course. This is the program myself and dozens of teachers have walked through over the summer to set up their classroom for back to school season in less than 4 weeks. The reason I created this program is as I was coaching one-on-one with teachers, I didn't want a lot of teachers spending their entire summer, unless they really wanted to, on setting up their classroom for back to school season. I would much rather you spend that time by the pool, traveling, spending time with your families and friends, reading, sleeping in. And so I wanted to create a program that walks you through my entire process to setting up your classroom in less than 4 weeks. So that's what I did, and I absolutely love this program. I love going through the program with a group of teachers every summer, so definitely make sure to check that out if you want the strategy behind setting up your classroom for success. All right, that wraps everything up. Make sure to subscribe or leave a review wherever you're tuning in from. As always, remember we are stronger together, and I'll see you in the next one, Teacher Bestie. Bye.